Hi guys, so I'm just going to do this final video on Sylvia Plath's poem Elm, and I'm just going to hopefully draw on some of the comments that came up on Google Classroom about some of the lines and phrases that stood out to you. So I just have some notes here I'm going to read through. As always, pop me a mail if you've any questions or you want to clarify anything, or of course if you've any ideas or views on the poem. This is the last Sylvia Plath poem that we're going to do, and we're going to move on to a new poet next week. It's Robert Frost we're going to move on to, so you've that to look forward to. But I will be giving you a Plath essay title that you can start working towards to start up your practice again, which you've all been amazing at doing. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first stanza of Elm, which I think we can all agree is a little bit unnerving. Again, Plath is using natural imagery in a much more sinister way than what we've seen before. Plath appears to be dramatising an exchange between herself and the elm by imagining what the tree might say to her. So it's almost like the elm tree is tormenting her or taunting her in some way. The immediate effect is eerily surreal, and the images that come to my mind are those images from, you know, Disney movies when they go into the woods and the trees start moving, or they might start talking and they're a bit sinister. That's the image that I have of Elm. So from the start, the narrative voice is obsessed with instability and despair. Okay, so there's a dichotomy, there's a duality between the voice of Plath and the voice of the elm. I know the bottom, the tree tells her. And the tree is described in both physical terms, my great taproot, and those of you who do biology, I think, should know what the great taproot is, but that's that big root in the tree that anchors it to the ground. I know the bottom, it says. I know it with my great taproot. So the taproot penetrates far into the ground, and that's that anchor the tree has. But it's also a state of mind. I do not fear it. The depth of depression imagined is reinforced by the repetition of I know, and the stark simplicity of the chilling comment, it is what you fear. So the voice of the elm is very similar to the voice of Mirror, and that idea of almost, I feel like the tree is almost relishing in the despair that the poet has. Just like the mirror relishes in the agitated wringing of hands, I think the elm also enjoys watching the despair. So the bizarre exchange between the two speakers continues into stanza 2. The elm questions the poet about the nature of her mental state. Does the wind blowing through its branches remind her of the haunting sound of the sea? And the idea of the sea being synonymous with destruction and despair, or even the voice of nothing, the numbing experience of madness, and that idea of colourlessness that we can see in Poppies in July, and how she calls on the opiates for numbness. So stanzas 3 and 4 focus on the dangers and disappointments of love. Love is a shadow, how you cry after it, and I feel that's very taunting of the elm, as almost as if the elm is better than or greater than feeling love, and that it has transcended any sort of feeling, and that the idea of feeling love is somehow showing weakness. The tone is fearful, emphasised by the comparison of a wild horse that has gone off. So run away, that sound of the hooves, and then that distant echoing, which is repeated later on. Till your head is a stone. And I talked a little bit about that idea of the stone and how I view that image, and how it reminded me of that Yeats poem, which I'm sure you all read when I posted it the other day, and how when you're fanatical about something, that it can almost dull your other senses to it. Maybe a little bit of rose-tinted glasses. And maybe that's something that we can all experience, or we can all have experience with in some way, that we are so focused on one thing you tend to not see anything else or not hear anything else. So the assonance that is used is effective at heightening the sense of hurt and abandonment. For much of the middle section of the poem, okay, so stanzas 5 to 9, that middle section, the elm's intimidating voice, again, the personification of something to be intimidating, to be domineering. So like the mirror is a dominant force for Plath, the elm also is too. So the intimidating voice continues to dramatize a series of horrifying experiences associated with insanity. And some of the lines that stood out to you guys the most were the sound of poisons, scorched to the root, and the imagery related to the moon. So the tree has endured extreme elements: rain, the sound of poisons; sunshine, scorched to the root; wind of such violence; and also the moon, her radiance scathes me. So like often we'll see imagery of the moon in poetry where it's quite beautiful, and the moon is often a very feminized depiction and image, again also tied up with mythology and fairy tales. But the moon, her radiance scathes me, again how the poppies mock her, and again imagery that we would associate with quite a positive experience. Plath sees it as a very much a negative. The harsh imagery and frenzied language, and I talked a little bit about that language before: burn, shriek, merciless, madness, all that violent imagery that Plath uses, combine to create a sense of shocking destructiveness. So stanzas 10 and 11 mark a turning point where the voices of the tree and the poet become indistinguishable. So is it the elm talking or is it Plath? The voices become connected. So this is achieved by the seemingly harmless image of the owl. And again, we're drawing back to imagery associated with mythology and fairy tales, the wise old owl. Think about how owls have been depicted in children's stories, for example. The one that stands out to me straight away is, of course, the wise owl in Winnie the Pooh. But this owl is a much more sinister owl. And the owl inhabiting the branches is searching for something to love. And maybe the image of the owl being a nocturnal creature, the sound of the owl, that hoo-hooing of the owl, is quite a haunting image. So the speaker is haunted by this dark thing, and I think that is possibly one of the most effective lines in Plath poetry: this dark thing that sleeps in me. The poet's vulnerability is particularly evident here when she acknowledges it, she faces it. And we talk a lot in about facing your fears, about owning it, etc., etc. I feel its soft feathery turnings, its malignity, and that is quite a scary image, this idea of the blackness inside Plath and how she fears it, how she can feel it turning, and perhaps that is when she feels the onset of a phase or in her depression. So Plath has come to relate her unknown demons to a deadly tumour. So she feels its malignity, its darkness, its devastation. In the last three stanzas, the poet's voice seems more distant and calm. It's the calm before the storm, that final storm. And we can't ignore the fact that this poem was written so close to when she took her own life. The image of the passing clouds, the faces of love, that idea of them passing by, maybe the idea of life flashing before your eyes, highlight the notion of rejection as the root cause of Plath's depression. The poem ends on a visionary note when she imagines being confronted by a murderous snake that appears in the branches. It petrifies the will. So that idea again of something lurking beneath, that idea of something, like I said at the very start of our study of Plath, something existing just in the periphery of Plath's vision. So in the mirror, it's that terrible fish rising towards her. In Elm, it's the snake in the trees that petrifies the will. The sense of growing terror builds to a hideous climax. And I think there are two ways to view this. Her final line, that kill, that kill, that kill. So the repetition of those two short words can be quite strong. It's a very alliterative phrase. the repetition of the hard K. It can be read quite aggressively, but I think it can also be read as a whisper. That kill, that kill, that kill. Like those snaky acids that she talks about. So we can see that as being either quite a violent image, or we can see it as Plath's acceptance or her resignation to the dark thing, and that she succumbs to the power of the elm. And of course the elm is a metaphor for the darkness that exists for Plath. So just to give you some idea of questions that can come up about Plath, it's very much related to her use of language and imagery, intense emotions, dark imagery. So sometimes there can be a question related to imagery being juxtaposed against intense emotions or dark emotions. So I want you to pay particular attention to her use of language, and how that can be interpreted and how we can view it. So I do keep referencing her interest in mythology and fairy tales, because oftentimes we see images in Plath that should be, or you know, we expect them to be a positive, especially her use of natural imagery, when in fact it's something much, much darker. So Plath creates a disturbing mood in this poem Elm. Giving the tree a speaking voice of its own is like something from a fairy tale, and that can be a positive, that can be a really nice experience, but oftentimes a tree talking in a fairy tale is not necessarily a good thing. So Plath compares love to a galloping horse. So think about that. Think about the power. Think about the feeling of powerlessness for the person watching that. She has no control. The love is just galloping away. She has no control over it. She can't chase it. She can't corral it. She can't control it. So she feels out of control and powerless. The poem, like a lot of the poems that we've looked at with Plath, there is a constant undercurrent of depression and madness. The atrocity of sunsets and the red filaments, and that is 100% a reference to her experience with electric shock therapy. And that idea of her hair standing on end. I have suffered the atrocity of sunsets. And again, a fantastic use of juxtaposition by Plath. Where the atrocity is something horrific. The Holocaust was an atrocity, but the atrocity of sunset, that's a juxtaposition of imagery there, a conceit that we don't expect there to be that kind of comparison between something that we associate to be so beautiful and a word that is synonymous with horror, despair and destruction, like atrocity is. So the speaker in the poem is confused and asks weird questions. Is it the sea you hear in me? So if we replace the image of the sea with the word destruction, is it destruction you hear in me? That kind of gives the elm more power and more control, and highlights again how out of control Plath feels. She's obsessive and paranoid. Again, the idea of the moon taunting her, the tree taunting her. A lot of the imagery is associated with nighttime, and as we know, that Plath was tormented by insomnia. So did she feel like that the nighttime was almost like a torment, that she had to endure night after night of this relentless turning of her mind and her thoughts, and that there was no reprieve from it? Again, come back to that imagery in Poppies in July, where she feels exhausted by life. So everything is against her as far as she imagines it. Even the weather is an enemy. The rain is arsenic. So poisoning. So this repeated imagery of the poison. The snake in the tree is coming after her. The poison, with poison again, it petrifies the will. The snaky acids. The dramatic scene unnerves the reader, and that's for sure. And when you're writing about Plath, talk about your personal response to it. Do you feel unnerved by what she talks about? Does it make you feel a little bit uncomfortable? So this represents Plath's deepest nightmare, the fear of loneliness, of being alone, of not having any validation, any support, any guidance, is a huge fear of Plath's. So violent verbs such as suffered disturb the reader, and the imagery, and the images, a hand of wires, the snaky acids hiss, create a surreal atmosphere. Think of the Adam and Eve, the snake. The poem